So, hello, Professor Scheffer. It's so great to have you here in our newsroom. So, Professor Scheffer, just a brief introduction about you. You served as the first United States ambassador at large for war crimes issues, and as ambassador, you participated in the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. You also led the U.S. negotiating team in United Nations talk on the International Criminal Court. So you are the perfect expert for our topic of the day, which is on Xinjiang about this genocide designation. As you know, yesterday, UN co-authors published a report basically claiming the Chinese government bears state responsibility for an ongoing genocide against the Uyghur in breach of UN Genocide Convention. So for our audience who are not familiar with the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, can you introduce us to the Institute a little better? Who are the authors and who are the experts on the panel?
Right. Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you, Lizzie, and to speak to a Chinese-American audience. The New Lines Institute used to be the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C., a very small think tank located on Massachusetts Avenue, where so many think tanks are. And its director is Dr. Azim Ibrahim, who is someone that has developed a tremendous amount of expertise over many years on the situation with the Rohingya in Myanmar. And I have worked with him focusing on the assault on the Rohingya people in 2017 and the consequences of that in terms of law and policy, and our own belief that the Burmese military and government were in fact involved in a genocidal attack against the Rohingya, which drove so many of them over into Bangladesh. The Center for Global Policy at that time, which is now the New Lines Institute, located at Fairfax University in Virginia, which is a fully accredited university, and it simply has a new location. And what the Institute does is it brings together people like me and many other experts to actually work on reports. It's not as if they have a vast staff. What they do is they bring the experts together. And the list of experts in this particular report is really quite impressive. It includes professors, from across the spectrum of the United States and overseas, professors from Stanford, from Ottawa, from Harvard, from the London School of Economics, and as well as some former ambassadors, as well as individuals who are not specialists in law, but rather are sociologists, are experts on the Uyghur population in China, are experts on China, quite frankly. And most of them are from academia. Some of them are from a more practical background in non-governmental organizations. But it's a very impressive, I think, collection of experts. And when one looks at the report, you can see the full list of them at the back of the report.
Thank you for that introduction. And for those of our audience who have not read the entire report yet, can you sort of give us a bullet point style summary of the key findings of the report?
Sure. This report is somewhat distinguished from some earlier reports, and there have been a good number of reports on the Uyghurs coming out through non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and others, and those are very important investigative reports which focus on the human rights abuses within the context of the Uyghur population in China. And there are other reports, most recently in March of 2020 out of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum by Aaron Rothenberg, who was an expert there and spent a lot of time looking at the situation of the Uyghurs and talking about the crimes against humanity perspective with the Uyghurs. There's a group that is a Congressional Executive Commission staff report on Capitol Hill, or in Washington, I should say, that also came out with a report in March 2020 to try to explain how egregious were the human rights violations in the supply chains of forced labor among the Uyghurs, and of course those products then are sold internationally. There's also a very interesting report by a barrister, a legal opinion issued by a barrister in Britain quite recently, within the last month or so, also looking at this issue of legal culpability and whether or not it rises to the level of genocide. Then there's our report. And it has been underway since, oh gosh, I think midsummer 2020 in a very intensive way. It's gone through many drafts. It essentially has been peer reviewed by this body of experts in law and history and the politics and the sociology of China. So I would liken it, if for those of you in your audience who are well versed in the academic life, this would be sort of comparable to a peer-reviewed article. Of course, almost all of its resources, which are footnoted extensively, are from open sources, interviews that have been undertaken with refugees or those who have escaped Xinjiang and have been able to speak on the outside. But it also involves a lot of media reports, as well as the official statements of Chinese officials over the years with respect to what is transpiring in Xinjiang and what is the Chinese government policy with respect to the Uyghur people. So what we wanted to do was to draw as much as we could from that source of evidence, because the intention of our report is quite focused. It's not to try to determine any individual criminal responsibility for atrocity crimes by any Chinese official, although one can sort of logically leap to some serious thinking about that once one reads the report. But its real intent is to try to determine, is there state responsibility on a governmental level for the commission of genocide against the Uyghurs? That's the sharp focus of the report. The report easily recognizes that crimes against humanity have been committed against the Uyghurs, and the government should be held responsible for crimes against humanity, which oftentimes can be far worse than genocide, quite frankly. It depends on the magnitude, the widespread character of the crime against humanity. And that is a very strong premise of study and accountability and responsibility with respect to the Chinese government, is crimes against humanity, which means a widespread or systematic assault on a civilian population with knowledge of that assault. And then there are many different types of crimes against humanity. When it comes to genocide, though, we really did have a specific task in front of us, which is to take the 1948 Genocide Convention. China is a ratified party of it as of 1983, and therefore accepts the responsibilities of a party to the Genocide Convention. And the two major responsibilities of a state are to prevent or punish the commission of genocide. And then, of course, within the convention, there is the definition of genocide. And that's what one has to work with very precisely to determine whether or not a government is responsible of that particular crime. I do want to make one general point, however, which I think needs to sort of color the whole context here. I am a law professor of many years and a lawyer, etc. And I work with people who look at the law. When it comes to atrocity crimes, one cannot become overly obsessed with asking, well, is this assault on the civilian population, is it genocide or not? Because if it's not genocide, then guess what? I don't have to worry about it. Well, that's not true. You do have to worry about it. It could very easily be a crime against humanity. And meanwhile, millions of people are suffering. You have to respond to that suffering. You have to respond to what is, in fact, criminal conduct. It's just that it might not rise to the ultimate level of genocide. But when we focus on genocide, it's because it is an exceptionally serious crime, particularly at the state level, because it must demonstrate a specific intent to destroy all or part of an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group, any one of those four protected groups, and the Uyghurs are an ethnic group. So that is so insidious, it is so horrific, because it's a reflection of the Holocaust. That's where the Genocide Convention had its origins, was in the Holocaust. And so therefore, that's a policy that must be confronted very directly. And over the last 30 years, we've had many examples in policy making where we've had to confront the issue of genocide. And this is one of them.
I see. That's a terrific introduction. For the next section of our interview, I just need to play the devil's advocate here.
Sure.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese pushback to those accusations. So, as you know, the Chinese government continues to deny any wrongdoing of genocide and war crimes, basically. And there are two arguments that I think are interesting and worth some discussion. First is the argument of population growth. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman put up some statistics of population, and she claimed that during the period between 2010 to 2018, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang actually grew by 25%, which is much higher than the 14% population increase for the entire Xinjiang region. So her argument was that, the Uyghur population was actually growing, so how could this be genocide if the population itself is growing? What's your response to that high population growth argument? Does it really undermine the findings of the report?
Well, it's a rather specious statement because, first of all, I would ask many questions. My first question is that actually the truth? In other words, prove it to me that there's been a 25% growth. I mean, what is the empirical proof? Secondly, it could reflect the fact that part of the campaign against the Uyghurs is one that results in the intermarriage of a Uyghur with a Han majority individual. And that itself is very insidious with respect to genocide, because you're breaking down the protected group of the Uyghurs, you're disseminating their ethnic origins into the Han majority. That's one way that you destroy a protected group. So it'd be interesting to know whether they're counting a Uyghur Han family that may then reproduce itself with Uyghur Han babies as somehow an expansion of the Uyghur population as a distinct ethnic group. I would want to ask that empirical question. And third, I would wonder whether part of the veracity of that statement hangs on the actual population growth within Xinjiang, which of course has increased because the Han majority has been brought into Xinjiang in large numbers over many years, particularly since, the last decade. And so I'd want to ask, well, how exactly are you counting that when you say the Uyghur population? But let me get to a more fundamental point. We are very used in the international community to thinking of genocide sort of like the Holocaust, namely you take millions of people and they are simply eliminated. They are killed. They are murdered in mass. That's the classic form of genocide. There are, however, four other, types of genocide. And they are outlined in the Genocide Convention. And the result of those four other types of genocide is, again, you are eliminating the existence of the protected group as such. In other words, as the Uyghur population, you would have to, it'd be sort of like arguing, well, I can demonstrate to you that if we follow these state policies with respect to Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, that 20, 30, 40 years from now, there might be people asking, what happened to the Uyghurs? In other words, where is the Uyghur ethnic group? Where is that ethnicity demonstrated in Xinjiang? If it can no longer be demonstrated, if the children who have been separated out, hundreds of thousands of them, into state-run orphanages and camps away from their Uyghur parents and culture, if they grow up not having that Uyghur identity as an ethnic identity, then you will have achieved the purpose of genocide under the Genocide Convention. And frankly, also, you can commit genocide without having killed a single person. Not a single, in fact, you could commit genocide even with an increase in population. But if while you're doing it, you are committing torture and rape and forced labor and indoctrination into a different ethnic identity or national identity and just stripping away the ethnicity completely, then you have achieved genocide because it was your specific intent to eliminate that ethnic identity in your society. And by the way, an easy way that governments sometimes do this, instead of the sophisticated way that it is under, that's occurring in China, very sophisticated, very bureaucratic, very systemic operation. But another way that governments often try to achieve this erasure of the ethnicity is simply through ethnic cleansing, which is a crime against humanity. You just push them out of the communities. You push them out of a region, as the Bosnian Serbs did the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniaks, as the Hutus in Rwanda did with the Tutsis. They not only killed, but they also were removing them from their communities. So there are many different ways genocide can occur, and we're still sort of learning how innovatively genocide can actually be implemented by a sophisticated government.
I see. That's a terrific answer to my question. And there's another pushback I frequently hear from various government agencies from China. Some form of questioning the honesty of witnesses is quite common. So, as you remember, BBC had a report on the genocide which documents accounts of horrendous sexual abuse and torture in those re-education camps. And when asked about that report, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman's response was basically, those witnesses have incentive to spread falsehood. They are untrustworthy. So I wonder how much evidence of abuse and mistreatment from that report comes from direct witnesses and victims themselves. And is this kind of evidence less verifiable to some extent? And how do legal experts handle that kind of evidence if it is not actually possible to confirm or cross-validate their statements?
Well, this raises a couple of interesting points. First of all, in our report, we draw upon the witness statements that have been made to other collectors of such testimony, whether they be non-governmental organizations, the media, etc. So it's not as if we had the capacity to go out, particularly into the Asian landscape, and interview ourselves these refugees. We were drawing from an open source reservoir of refugee interviews, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, after all, if one organization is able to interview a refugee and then report it globally, yes, we should all respond to that. We should listen to that. That should resonate. That should demonstrate a certain level of authenticity of people who are trying to collect information. The refugee interview process, my experience with it it can be a very extensive and drawn out process. When I was ambassador at large for war crimes issues, we did a lot of interviewing of refugees. It's a very common practice to get the testimony of refugees in order to establish what's happening on territory that you're not able to physically get onto yourself. And at the time of the expulsion of the refugees, and at the time that crimes are being committed against them on that forbidden territory. And I can just give you so many examples that's just a very common practice to interview refugees. Now, it will always be the case that the government involved will deny the veracity of the refugees' testimony. I mean, this is just common. So you expect it. There's nothing unusual about the Chinese government denying it because it's a knee-jerk reaction by a government to deny the testimony of refugees. But when you meet these refugees one-on-one, and I've done it a lot in the past, you have to really question, for what reason would these refugees be concocting these lies about such cruelty that has been inflicted upon them that obviously creates such emotional distress and has forced them to flee their country and their homes in extreme poverty with no certainty of what is before them, to live in absolutely squalid refugee camps. They want to do that? Are you kidding? Of course they do not want to do that. And so what is it that's driven them to this desperation? Well, you sit down and you ask a very coherent set of questions to the refugees. It's a pretty organized process. And the NGOs are very skilled at it. Governments are very skilled at it. The US government, my goodness, we did it throughout the 1990s. On Darfur, we did it with Darfur refugees fleeing into Chad. We've done it with lots of Rohingya refugees that flee into Bangladesh. I think I would stack up the general totality of refugee testimony, shall we say, to a simple knee-jerk denial by the perpetrator government. It's obviously in their interest to deny it. So you have to approach it from that perspective.
Gotcha. That's super helpful. So next I wanted to turn to the United States government a little bit. So there was this foreign policy article published roughly a month ago, which says United States Department's Office of Legal Advisors concluded earlier this year that China's mass imprisonment and forced labor of Uyghurs amount to a crime against humanity, but there was insufficient evidence to prove genocide. So that was kind of interesting. But, as we saw yesterday, the State Department confirmed that the Biden administration would continue to endorse the Trump administration's determination that China has committed genocide in Xinjiang. So how should we reconcile those sort of seemingly contradictory stances all coming from the government?
Well, you're speaking to someone who has considerable experience in that field, working within the State Department as an ambassador for war crimes issues, and then, of course, working closely with the lawyers in what we call the legal, in the State Department. And we went through this exercise on Bosnia. We went through it on Rwanda. They went through it on Darfur. On the Rohingya situation, the Yazidi situation in northern Iraq. It is a process, and it is very common. And frankly, one expects it because it's a good cautionary pull within the system that the lawyers in will look very technically at what would essentially be the standard required in an international criminal tribunal against an individual perpetrator of genocide. In other words, is there enough evidence to demonstrate not only the actus reus, which is the action, the act of genocide, whether it be killing or creating unlivable conditions, separating children, and rape and sexual violence, etc., torture. Are those in place? And then secondly, can we prove as a lawyer, as if we were in a courtroom, that there has been specific intent to do this in order to destroy all or a substantial part of that ethnic, national, racial, or religious group? When you enter that examination as a lawyer, you are instinctively very cautious. And the policymakers understand that. They're going to want you to come forward with, frankly, usually, the most cautious assessment, to be very, very careful. But there is a reality check that ultimately occurs in that legal analysis, which is when you look at the totality of the picture of what is occurring, what inference can you draw from all of the actions that are taking place, how the government is directing those actions, what could possibly be their objective in doing so, what are the plausible reasons for it? And that's what we call arriving at an inferential intent to commit genocide. The lawyers will always consider that a difficult task. The policymakers, who have to deal with state responsibility issues, not going after an individual, but a state responsibility level, can say, my goodness, it's obvious. I mean, it's transparently obvious what is going on here. And so they can reach that determination that there is genocide being perpetrated by a government, I think, a little faster than the lawyers usually get there, but then they do ultimately get there, And so the duty on the government, and this is important for your audience to absorb, the duty at the governmental level when we're looking at genocide is we have a duty under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. Now think about that. Do we have to wait 5 years to determine literally that a case of genocide could be successfully prosecuted in a courtroom against an individual leader before we exercise our duty to prevent that genocide? Then it's too late. The genocide has happened. And so it's very important at the government level that you determine this genocide issue at the most reasonable level with a clear and convincing standard of proof, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but a clear and convincing standard of proof at the governmental level in order to exercise your duty to prevent that genocide from continuing.
And I'm sure many of our audience will learn a lot from that. So for some of the more cynical people in our audience, they might be sort of chalking this up to political grandstanding. And as you know, during the Trump administration, the US and China relations sort of went through a particularly tumultuous period of time. And, the genocide designation, along with other designations, were kind of rushed through. Were they just rushed through without solid legal basis? Is the previous administration just trying to, push as many hawkish China policies through the door as possible before they left office? So, to those cynics, are you concerned by the risk of politicizing and eroding the power of designation?
Well, 2 points to make. First, I want to go back to the fundamentals just for a second to say whether it's a crime against humanity or genocide, at the end of the day, in terms of state action, it's irrelevant. It is an atrocity that must be responded to. So even if there were no genocide determination whatsoever, my position would be that the US government has an enormous responsibility to deal with the crime against humanity being inflicted upon the Uyghurs, an enormous responsibility to do what it can to pull that back and to persuade the Chinese government to change the course of their policies against the Uyghurs so that there is no crime against humanity. But then, of course, there's genocide. And I think in terms of the Trump and the Biden administrations, remember that the Biden administration foreign policy team during the campaign made the determination, I think it was in July or August of 2020, that genocide, in fact, was occurring against the Uyghurs. So it's not as if Biden now has to hold up what might arguably be a defective Trump determination on genocide last minute, on the last day of their administration, by Secretary of State Pompeo declaring it. Rather, it's very consistent with what had already been concluded at the policy level by the Biden foreign policy team during the campaign. And they, believe me, that was a huge team. I was not on it. But it was a huge team that really bore into just the corpus of American foreign policy. And so therefore they were ready to run the day they gained office on January 20th. And this is an issue that they were already running on. So it was very consistent. As for, again, the lawyer issue within L, that gets worked out over a series of weeks and months when one is making a genocide determination. The lawyers will always be more cautious and a little more delayed in how they arrive at decisions. But I'll just tell you, that was one of the mistakes we had on the Rwanda genocide in 1994, is that the State Department lawyers, it took them until the genocide started on April 6th, and it took them until late May of 1994 to reach that determination of genocide. We should have, at least a few weeks earlier than that, at least been talking about the precursors of genocide, because we knew it was coming. As policymakers, we knew it was coming. And we should have reacted as if we were dealing with a genocidal situation, even though the lawyer's determination would come a few weeks later.
I see. So final question of the day, I'm just looking into the future a little bit. Does the designation actually trigger legal repercussions, and does it require you to take specific actions? And what are some of the future courses of actions we can potentially talk about?
It's an excellent question. There are 151 states parties to the Genocide Convention the last time I looked. And each one of them has the obligation as a state party to prevent or punish genocide. Now, that doesn't mean that one has to immediately consider the use of military force or that kind of remedy, but it does mean you've got to do something, and that can be in terms of trying to prevent it from occurring again, from continuing. Or to begin, or to start, one does have many tools. You have a lot of diplomatic tools. You have tools you can use within the UN system and the human rights system that is embedded, within the United Nations. You have lots of economic tools you can use, sanctions, etc. You have the bully pulpit of a powerful nation like the United States from the State Department and White House podiums in terms of naming and shaming. But again, you can also use even diplomatic sanctions in terms of preventing certain individuals from, traveling to your country, etc. So there are those types of sanctions. I will say this: there is currently, as part of the U.S. Federal Criminal Code, there is the Genocide Accountability Act. And I had the privilege of being involved in helping to work that towards adoption into our criminal statute. And that means that any individual who arrives in the United States and can be subject to an indictment and thus criminal justice for the commission of the crime of genocide, even though it happened outside of the United States. All that person needs to do is to set foot on the territory of the United States, and then we can take him or her down. And so Chinese officials would be subject to the Genocide Act. I mean, they have to think about that. There's a bill that I hope can become law this year called the Crimes Against Humanity Act, whereby same idea. You commit crimes against humanity outside the United States and you decide to visit Disneyland, well, welcome to Disneyland and then to apprehension by a U.S. Marshal. So those things are out there, but I must say that you know, the U.S. government already has imposed some sanctions against individuals with respect to the Uyghur situation. But I would almost go, you know, well, there are so many things one could do. One could challenge China in the World Bank in terms of World Bank financing for Chinese projects, particularly if they relate to Xinjiang and forced labor camps. I mean, it's implausible that the World Bank would be financing anything related to that. One could work with major international, multinational corporations whose supply chains reach into Xinjiang and to those forced labor facilities, and really hold those corporations responsible and accountable for having any of their products manufactured in those facilities and then traded internationally. And, you know, one could even go so far, I know it sounds rather extreme, but one could go so far in terms of products that are coming from China into the United States. This might require legislative action, but one could say, yes, it has to say made in China, but it could possibly read as follows: made in the genocidal nation of China, or made in China, warning, forced labor is present in China. In other words, you're telling the consumer, you know, we're not idiots. We actually understand what's happening at the origin of this supply chain. So you too should be aware of this, just like there are warnings about, you know, the dangers of smoking and, or for kids' toys and stuff, there are warnings about certain components or risks regarding those toys that one should be aware of in terms of purchasing them. That kind of warning could also just be a general requirement for garments and other items that are coming from that part of China. So those are some of the ideas.
I see. This has been such a helpful conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Scheffer. It's so great to talk to you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.